Welcome to Perspectives on Neurodiversity, a podcast dedicated to challenging myths and assumptions about neurodiverse life. I am your host, Christopher Scott Wyatt, speaking as the Autistic Me. Offering the perspective of an educator and consultant, Ginny Sandler joins us on this episode to discuss how families and schools can support autistic students. With a Master of Arts degree in literacy and a Master's of Education in autism supports, Ginny promotes best practices for teaching neurodiverse students. Ginny's website is homeschooluk.com, where you can learn more about her and the services she provides to families and schools. Ms. Sandler, it is an honor. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It is great to be here and speak to you.
You want to do what's called natural accommodation, which is where we promote best practices that end up helping all students, not just neurodiverse students, but the entire community. Why do you believe that's so important to student success?
The first thing I want to say is I'm based in London in the UK, although I am American. So just to clarify that. And in the standard British state school or public school, there are 30 children in a single classroom, often with one teacher, depending on the age of the children. And that, if you just think about that, that to me is very challenging. To be one teacher with 30 children responsible for managing everyone's behavior, ensuring that they hit their educational targets, and also that their social and mental health and well-being are being supported and their physical health is being supported. I think it's a lot to ask for a single person. And when I see all the sort of the different approaches that teachers use to support different types of learners, I think it's quite overwhelming. And it would just be a lot simpler for everyone if they used best practice for autistic children, essentially. And then that would ensure that everyone who has additional learning needs or learns in a different way, that their needs are being met. That children who may have additional needs, but that we don't know, that their needs are being met, and certainly is not going to adversely affect a child who just, learns in a typical fashion. So that's kind of where it comes from. We know what works really well for autistic learners. Let's apply that across.
When we talk about various locations, it seems that we have problems supporting diverse students regardless of country.
Yeah.
I've had guests from France. We've talked to people from Australia, Canada, the UK, Ireland, and it seems everywhere is struggling with how to meet the needs of the learning differences that our students have.
Yeah.
We have crowded students into classrooms with too few teachers, too few paraprofessionals, too few support experts, and the teachers are struggling.
Yeah.
What should we be doing differently in these models that we're employing internationally of one teacher, 30 students, and it's not working?
I'd be really interested actually to see research into the effects of class size and number of teachers or paraprofessionals, assistant teachers in the classroom. Because I don't know the data about that, because you do hear that actually 30 kids in a class is okay. But what I think is what we need to do, are you asking me, can we start from the very beginning and I can just design a school from scratch? Because that would be the ideal. So I would say you start with the building. I mean, there's a lot of research into architecture and building design, and you would have lots of space and designated spaces and hallways and corridors and stairways where it's not crowded, where maybe you have a one-way system. You have stairs for going up and stairs for going down, where you have breakout areas. So if you need to take a small group of children out somewhere where you can work with them, or if someone needs to take a break, like physically, they need to just chill out for a little bit, regulate themselves, space to do that. In a typical classroom, I mean, you walk in and it's overwhelming. And as a teacher, when I worked in the classroom, I wanted my classroom to be amazing. I wanted the brightest displays. I wanted everyone's work on show. You want all that, but actually, is that really what is best and most sort of appealing? And it's, visually very overwhelming. And if you had a classroom, for example, where the kids all have like their cubbies and their pegs and their hooks with their bags and their coats. And if you live somewhere cold in the winter and it's overflowing with stuff, how nice would that be if it could be hidden from view? It's behind a wall. Or if you could easily dim the lights, if you could, not have the type of floor where the chairs scrape. Just very like simple things that I get you can't just snap your fingers and do, because schools don't have money. Schools are often in old buildings. Schools are often built on budgets with cheap materials like fluorescent lights and things like that. So even just to me, that's a good start. If you could have the sort of ideal architecturally sound, autism friendly building. And going from there, I would say some of the best teachers I know are the ones that are really, really organized. And I do not put myself in that category because I am classic ADHD. I have brilliant ideas, but I'm a mess. And just like physically, I'm a mess. I have my supplies everywhere. But a classroom everything has a space. And there's always a plan. And you're not having these sort of last minute, oh, yeah, guys, this is really fun. Let's do this. Just, you have the plan. You stick to it as best as you can. If you have to go off plan, there's a plan for going off plan. Everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing, where they're supposed to be. I think people want that. Children want that. It feels really good. So just organized, neat, clear, consistent. And that, I think, is ideal. And I'm not even talking about any academic adjustments, have I? I've not even said anything about pedagogy. I've just talked about the space. And I could go on and on and on. But that's what I would start with, is having the right spaces.
When my wife and I were considering what to do for our children as we returned to school this year, we ended up with 2 charter schools. Here in the state of Texas, charter schools can be privately operated. They get a portion of the money that a public school would normally get, but not the full amount.
Right.
And then they fundraise and get donations or do whatever they need to do. And most of them are nonprofit corporations. Our youngest attends a charter school that specializes in students who are struggling socially,
right,
or with learning disabilities. And we just had her IEP meeting, her individualized education program meeting. It is a school that has uniforms. Everywhere has ramps. Everywhere is well lit, nice lighting, plus lots of natural lighting. The hallways are wide and the students go on one side or the other to go to and from class. Even the uniforms reduce her stress.
Yeah.
Because she knows every day, brown pants, blue shirt.
Yeah.
Every day. There's always a little bit of a freedom factor with parents. They want to know, why can't my child express his or herself? But for these children, that actually becomes one less thing to worry about.
Yeah.
What am I going to do? The knowing that they march on a particular side of the hallway for safety and get to and from class in a particular way. The ramps, it sounds simple to put ramps everywhere, but this is a fairly new building.
Yeah, it is hard.
Everyone benefits, not just people with wheelchairs, but people moving media carts, students moving the lunch carts or the snack carts, the library carts and the computer carts all roll up and down the ramps. So this building, having been planned to be accessible and planned for these accommodations of all needs, it's just really, in terms of space, as you said, it's one less thing to worry about. And in terms of the uniforms and the uniformity of the teachers, it is, again, one less thing to worry about. You can focus then on the instruction when everything has a place and there's a place for everything, not crammed into corners, not tucked wherever you have available. But unfortunately, when I look at our public school district, they have one high school right now. They need to build two more
Right.
because of the population changes and demographic changes. So everything is crammed into the older high school where there's not enough room. It wasn't built for accommodation. And as you said, older buildings without these ramps, without the natural lighting, without spaces for everything you need in today's classroom. So yeah, the space becomes an impediment to teaching when you're trying to cram too much into too little space.
Yeah.
Too many students, too many teachers, not enough room for the library, not enough room for a computer lab. It's chaos.
Yeah. It's not set up for ideal learning. And some children can manage it, but I'm using the word manage. I'll say some children are coping and I'm using cope. Okay, well, that's fine. Really? Is it? I don't know. We don't want to manage. We don't want to cope. We want everyone to thrive. I don't think people are disagree with us. I mean, we're making a lot of sense. And I just think it comes down to funding and who's going to put up the money for a brand spanking new building with all of these features.
When we move on to the pedagogy, we were talking about class size, and I need to review some of the research because everything I read was, 10 years ago on class sizes. The homogeneous nature of a class, the uniformity of the student matters a lot. If you get 30 students who are middle class from an educated suburb of London or Paris or Austin or New York or Los Angeles, they're going to be a particular type of student. The parents are college educated. They're from the technocratic class. They understand how to navigate these systems. But in many schools, you do not have that. You do not have the uniformity, the homogeneity. And instead, you have this heterogeneous mix of everything.
Yeah.
You have high achievers, low achievers, new immigrants,
Yeah.
sixth generation students whose family have lived somewhere forever. And so the more mixed a class is, the more diverse a classroom is, I think the more difficult those larger class sizes are. Give me 60 engineering students at the university, no problem. But give me 30 who come from all different majors, all different backgrounds, all different expectations, and teaching just got a lot harder, even though the class got smaller.
Yep, that's a very good point.
And so we're expecting teachers to deal with not just 30 students, but 30 very different students.
Yeah. When it comes to pedagogy, then there are some really very basic changes that a teacher can make to the way they work that would pick up all different types of learners. So whether you have children who are really bright, or maybe someone who's really bright, but English is an additional language. So they're being held back by that. Or, someone who's really bright, but is dyslexic, or someone who's less able, but also is English as an additional language. I mean, there's so many different types of people that, we teach. And I'm just going to give a really, it's simple. It's almost like too simple, but let's just take font size and line spacing. If we just enlarge the font and increase the line spacing and the spaces in between words, it's going to help a lot of children. The only negative that I can think of is that it wastes paper, right? Not as good for the environment. And if you have someone who feels very overwhelmed and you have to give them a thicker, stack of papers because the font means you have more paper, then that can be overwhelming too. But why is it that, I have children who are neurodivergent, and I feel like it's just been such an argument every time I send these emails. Can you please enlarge the font? Can you please enlarge the font? They're very capable, but they have some, visual tracking difficulties, and a large font takes a lot of the strain away. So I think that's something that can be done across the board. Another thing with reading, a lot of times in schools, they do reading comprehensions. They read something and then they have to answer the questions. And you have your reading paper, and then maybe on the back, there are the questions, or in another packet, there are the questions. And generally, like, the conventional wisdom is you read through the whole story, you go to the questions, if you can't remember an answer, you go back and look in the passage to find your answer. But I say, or what I do with the children I work with, is I go through the passage and I go through the questions, and I do some cutting and pasting, and I put the questions in at the part of the passage where that question is likely to be discussed. Or I'll tell the child, right after you read these first 2 paragraphs, answer questions 1, 2, and 4. Like I'll check it in advance. If you did that, that would make answering the comprehension so much straightforward for children who struggle with working memory. They read something and it doesn't stick. But I hear the argument, oh, but that's dumbing it down, right? My child is up for the challenge. My child has a great working memory. My child's going to have the questions at the end. And I think about it, but is it really dumbing it down? I don't think it is, because what is the purpose of a reading comprehension? Why do we give it to children? It's so they can think about and analyze and criticize and learn new vocabulary, all from this story, from this passage. And if that's the purpose of it, does it matter if they are thinking and analyzing and learning new vocabulary as they read through the passage? Or does it matter if they're then going back and, checking it at the end? I just think that if we simply change the way we do something so basic like a reading comprehension, with enlarged font, of course, that is going to make it so much more accessible to a variety of different learners and not adversely affect neurotypical learners.
Literacy is the gatekeeper for our educational systems.
Yeah.
In every country, the standard language is used for testing. It is used for instruction. It's used for everything. And so if a student is struggling with literacy in the language of their country, their community, that becomes a struggle then in science. It becomes a struggle in history. It becomes a struggle in all of the subjects, because reading success and literacy is so key.
Yeah.
And yet our greatest shortages, at least in my experience right now, are in the experts of literacy, whether it's dyslexia supports, whether it's reading language specialists. How do we address this when it's often just that one teacher, maybe if you're lucky, a paraprofessional and a teacher, trying to support that key skill that becomes the point of failure for so many young people?
That's a tricky one, because, to teach reading really well, there's a lot of one-on-one involved. So I think it's a school that's well-resourced will have the staff to sit with children and listen to them read daily. Parents ideally should be listening to their children read daily. I can tell you that Jenny the parent and Jenny the literacy specialist are 2 very different people, because we all know working with your own children can be quite challenging. But the more children are exposed to literature, then it's going to improve their reading. But what I would say is that when a teacher's managing a class of 30 and everyone is at different levels and people do need different types of support along the way, is to again, not put these restrictions, like everyone has to do it this way. So some children can listen to the audio version, right? Some children can listen to an audio version and read along with the text. Some children will be, their individual reading book will be well below the rest of the class. And if that's the case, then when they're doing something like a whole class text that everyone's supposed to be reading together, then when they do that, they should be given the audio version of it. If you're reading, Cat in the Hat level type of text, and your class is reading There's a Boy in the Girl's Bathroom as a class text, you should be listening to the audio version so you can engage in the conversation and comprehend. And I think that's a little bit what teachers are afraid to do. They're afraid to say, oh, it's okay to listen to the audio version, because if you do it, then he'll want to do it and she'll want to do it. Whereas I'm kind of saying, so what? Actually, maybe the reason why those children want to do it is because they need it. And it's okay to say, well, these ones listen, these ones read. And it's okay to say sometimes you read, sometimes you listen, just to not put so much weight on everything. So I guess that would be some of my advice. But I do agree that it's hard to teach such an inconsistent group how to read.
You mentioned parents, and I know that parents are busy, life is hectic, but in the end, that one-on-one reading experience is often limited to home.
Yeah.
And whether it's grandparents or aunts and uncles, an older sibling, or even reading aloud to a younger sibling, our students need to be reading at home.
Yeah, they do.
They have to. I hate to say it, but even among my university students, a lot of them are non-native speakers. They really need that oral experience so they can hear words and learn how to say them. And I mentioned to my class that what I do is when I'm reading something unfamiliar, I will also listen to the audiobook, because I may not know how a French phrase is said, or I may never have heard a Latin phrase before. So hearing that audiobook not only improves my reading, but it improves my cultural awareness.
Yeah.
People do use phrases. I use the example of hors d'oeuvres.
Yeah,
Yeah, hors d'oeuvre? What is an hors d'oeuvre?
Yeah.
Hors d'oeuvres was one of those where hearing it on the audio or hearing someone else say it, like, oh, wow, I've been reading that incorrectly. I had no idea what I was reading.
Yeah.
Even for adults, an audio can help.
Yeah. Well, I think when I first read Harry Potter, I was in college. I think it was my sophomore year of college. And it was the book where Victor Crumb, maybe it was Bulgarian, I can't remember, but Victor Crumb comes into the story and he struggles to pronounce Hermione's name. I think that's book 4, the 4th book. So it took me until that long to realize it's pronounced Hermione and not Hermione, because I was not familiar with too many Greek stories. I wasn't familiar with the name Hermione. I was reading it Hermione. I come from a middle class, very educated family, and we all, make these mistakes. And one of the things I love with children, especially children who are voracious readers, when you hear them use words and you know that they've never heard the word pronounced, and they're saying it as they've read it. And I wish I could come up with an example off the top of my head. I can't, but it's really gorgeous when they say a word incorrectly because that's how they've been reading it. So yeah, audible books help with that for sure.
My oldest, we have the routine of reading together 2 or 3 times a week right now. And she's reading The School for Good and Evil, which is I think a 6-book series.
Right.
She kept saying that the dress was chit. And it took me a while to say, honey, that's chic.
Yeah.
Oh, well, what does that mean? Well, what do you think it means? And even though she's a voracious reader, there are things like that. And she gets frustrated because she likes her rules and her order. That's part of her autistic nature. She likes rules. And phonetic awareness only gets you so far as a reader.
Yeah.
Especially as the French words slip in, or, here's suddenly a word that came from Arabic and entered US English. And
yeah,
there's all these words where, I know your phonemic lessons, but this word isn't English.
That's the problem with English, is there are so many exceptions to the rules.
And for someone who lives by rules, as my daughter does, that's very troubling. She finds it very annoying when things don't follow rules.
Yeah, I find actually English is a very frustrating language. And I do feel that the expectation to teach children to read and write is getting younger and younger, and it's becoming more and more intense. And there are all these phonics rules, and they're all using words like graphemes and phonemes and digraphs. And I'm like, God, I don't remember learning to read and using that language. And I think that's also challenging. The way we teach reading, I find that it's very much one way or the other. It's either schools are like super into phonics and everything is phonics based, which takes a lot of fun out of reading, or there's not enough emphasis on phonics and there's too much sight words. And you do need to have some phonemic awareness. So I like a combined model of high frequency sight words and synthetic phonics. And I think it just takes time, and we don't get enough time, at least in the UK. I do feel like the US is a little bit more relaxed with teaching children how to read.
So a question that I have, your website, it has homeschool in the title.
Yeah.
Right? Homeschool UK. How did you find it during the pandemic when parents were at home and were responsible for teaching and homeschooling just became the norm? How did that change what you did as a consultant and as an advisor to families? So when did you have to become Homeschool UK? And how did that evolve during the pandemic to now?
That's really interesting. So I only became Homeschool UK I think it was 2019, maybe 2018. I'd have to check. I was basically doing exactly what I'm doing, but without a website. I was just me, just Jenny, and people would get my name from friends, or they'd find me through an agency. And then at around 2019, I decided I needed to join the 24th century and have a website and have a LinkedIn and have a presence. And because I had been homeschooling a lot of children, that's kind of how I shifted from working in the classroom to working privately. I started working with a family that homeschooled their children. And then I got an American family, actually, an American family living in London who had chosen to homeschool. And that led me to more work with families who were homeschooling, but not because they had chosen it, because their circumstances had sort of foisted it upon them. So mostly children coming from private schools who had been asked to leave because the school is not able to manage their either diagnosed or undiagnosed ADHD, autism, and there were too many behavioral challenges, and these children were left without a school. And while the parents needed to figure out plan B, I would come in and work with them one-to-one.
Just to pause there for listeners, the public-private terminology is different in the UK.
Yeah.
And getting into a school is not as simple as you just walk down the street and you're enrolled.
You're correct.
It is a more complex system. And if your child ends up out of either the public or private system, shifting gears is not as simple as it is in the United States or even Canada, where you find your community school and your child has instant access to that school. It's not the same.
No, it's not the same. And when children are at private school in the UK, which we call them private schools here, and independent. The general term is independent, but people understand private. They're generally academically select. Not all of them, but they're academically selective. They have very high standards for how children should be. And if you don't fit into that box, then they've got someone else who very happily take your place. Not all independent schools are like that. I mean, some are obviously incredible and very accommodating, but I have been working with children who have not been so accommodated. And then it's not always so simple to go to your local state school. There's usually one that you technically should be entitled to go to. The local authority has the responsibility to educate your child. But lots of times families who've been in a private school they don't want to put their child in the local state school. It's socioeconomically a very different environment, and the classes size is going to be a lot bigger. So if you know you're dealing with someone who's already struggling in a class of 20, to then chuck them into a class of 30 with no friends, no one who they know already, is not always the best option. So it can take a while to figure out what it is you're going to do to get your child an education. And sometimes these children, they need a break. And school has been so traumatic that they're not ready to return to any school environment. So I was the homeschool teacher. I was becoming the autism ADHD homeschool teacher. And so when I set up a website, that's where I decided to use that, Homeschool UK. That's where the name came. But I wasn't exclusively doing that. I was doing all sorts of work and all sorts of teaching and tutoring. And now I actually do probably less homeschooling. And I'll get to the reason why in a moment. And someone suggested that maybe I should change the name of my website, like Jenny Sandler Education Consultant or Education Therapist or something like that. But I decided that I like homeschool because it can be so many different things. It could be homeschooling in the traditional sense of home education. It could be that, children are at home and children are at school and they need, teaching in both of those environments. I am the connection between home and school because I often liaise between families and schools or help parents advocate for themselves. Or when I go into schools and I offer training. And a lot of what I talk about is what people need to do. And you said it when you introduced me, is how you can, accommodate for neurodivergency at home and at school. So that's why I've stuck with the name Homeschool UK, even though I'm not exclusively homeschooling children. And then with the pandemic, that was really, really interesting because with a website like Homeschool UK, when all of a sudden the world is homeschooling, you're going to get very, very busy. And I did. I was very busy. I switched to working on Zoom, which I had never done before. I had never even taught online, not on Skype, nothing. And it was a huge learning curve. And what it showed me, though, is for the majority of children, in-person learning is better. In the same way, I wish I could be sitting with you in your room in Texas and, talking. But there were some things that worked really, really well online. And one of the things that I started doing was teaching children how to read over Zoom. And I started making books. I make a lot of individualized books, but I started doing it on PowerPoint. And it was so much better. And I could really individualize texts because it was so easy. So I would scan like a standard reading book and then make my own words because, I have to do it on the screen anyway. And so I found that really revolutionized the way I was reading with children to the point that now when I work with children in person, I'm still using PowerPoint and using it to make books. And there are lots of, great literacy games that, like, for example, memory cards and bingos, which are much easier to do on a screen than in person. So before I'm, constantly cutting up flashcards and making games. Now I'm doing it on all these apps. It takes 2 seconds. And the other thing is when you meet on Zoom and no one's traveling anywhere, you can really meet in a way or in a time that's best for that child. So instead of having an hour lesson at my house, I could meet you every day for 15 minutes on Zoom. Now you tell me, you're the professor of education. What's the better way to learn to read? 1 hour a week for 1 hour a week of intense reading, or 4 times a week for 15 minutes?
And I would much rather have my students have shorter classes more frequently.
Yeah.
Just even for the retention. But you give someone 6 days away from something and it is amazing how quickly the skills fade.
Yeah.
And then you spend part of the next hour revisiting what you did a week ago.
Yeah. But that's what the pandemic really showed me, is that I could use technology in a way I hadn't thought of before. And another thing that I think has changed is that schools, at least where I am, are a lot more accepting of people like me coming in to support children. And so previously, schools they kind of want to do their own thing. And if a parent said, "Oh, I have a tutor, I'd like to bring them in," schools are, "Oh, they're not so sure if you do it, but everyone will want to do it. We don't have space." But I think since COVID, schools are like, "You've got someone, you're going to pay them, you want to bring them in, fine, like please do." And so I'm able to go into schools a lot more. And there's one school in particular that is very local to me that I have quite a few students in. And I've been able to use that model of little and often. So I'm in that school every day, but I'm seeing children for 15 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes at a time instead of an hour at a time. And I think it works so much better. So for me, that's been one of the mixed blessings of the pandemic.
Before the pandemic, I relied on technology a lot as an instructor. I keep online calendars, online copies of my notes, online transcripts of lessons or of slides. And I always did this because it helped me in my executive functions. If I have a calendar that says I have deadlines on Tuesday and Thursday, then that online calendar becomes a support.
Yeah.
I'm very poor at time management. I am very poor at remembering when things are due and where they're going. And what I found was by having the online shell many years before the pandemic, it gave me a way to remind students, okay, you're going to get an email on the morning things are due. Remember, they're due by midnight that day.
Right.
So technology in many ways has benefited those of us who are neurodiverse, whether it's ADHD or an ASD diagnosis. Time management is frequently one of our greatest challenges. We overestimate, oh, I can get to that later. I can do that. So I have found the technology, its greatest asset for me and for many of my students has been that constant awareness of the approaching deadline, of the homework I should read, or the assignments I need to grade as an instructor. During the pandemic, poorly implemented technology scared a lot of parents and students away from the technology. And I hope now that we have gone through several years that the technology is being used more wisely and as a support instead of just as, well, we've got to move this online and however we get it there is fine. I hope we're doing it better.
It's interesting you say that because I also work with some older children because I'm an elementary school teacher. That's the general age I work with. But I also work with some middle and high school kids on their executive functioning and their study skills. You would think that having everything online is a big advantage. But what I see actually, and maybe it's just the schools that they're in are not using the system so well, but it is incredibly overwhelming and chaotic. And you take Google Classroom, for example. The class stream, or not the class stream, but there's a place where they use Google Classroom for lessons, okay? For what the work they're doing in class. And then there's the section for homework. But some teachers are posting homework in the lesson section. And when students of mine go to see what homework they have and they click on the to-do list, it's not there. And instead, they're having to go through each of their classes individually, looking to see if the teacher stuck the homework in somewhere random. And that is, for someone with ADHD or executive function challenges, that's just like way too much. Then the other issue I have is because you're not printing things out for students, you can give them so much information. So when it's time for an exam, teachers are just uploading loads and loads and loads of past papers and revision work they can do. And like, well, how do you know what you're meant to do? How do you filter through it? Whereas, previously you just be given a packet and it was more manageable. And then all the textbooks are online now. And I think that's brilliant. No more schlepping your book to school and from home. But I still think it's nice to have a physical book because you have to you have your login for this online textbook and your login for that online textbook. And then there's the math. There's a math program here that I don't know if you have it in the US. I think it's a great program. But in order to make sure that children are doing their working out and taking some type of record, each question is given a code. So question 1 is like code. It's multiple letters and numbers, K436 or something. And then randomly, they'll say, what is the code for question 1? And if you don't put in K436, or they'll say, sorry, what's the answer? What's the answer for K436? And if you don't put in the correct answer, boom, the whole lesson is gone and you have to start again. Really, really difficult for someone who's like going to forget to write down the codes. So I think the technology is amazing and it can be so helpful, but teachers and schools really need to be on the ball with it and consistent and use it wisely.
We do need to have consistency in our course designs online. I do it when I get to design my own courses. I like it by week. I don't like to have all 15 or 16 weeks up at once. I would rather a student only see the current week. I don't understand making everything available all at once because that's overwhelming for everyone, not just the neurodiverse.
Yeah.
I see 16 weeks of a semester. I'm just, oh my gosh, I have all that coming up. But if you show me this is what's going on this week.
Yeah.
And it's all in one place. It's the readings, it's the quiz, it's the test, reading, whatever. It should be in a logical order. It should be small, contained, chunked. But again, not only does that help the neurodiverse student, but it helps everyone because I think every student is overwhelmed when we just throw everything at them.
Yeah, for sure.
By going online, we can now say, oh, here's a link to this article and a link to that and a link to this other.
Yeah.
And we would never have given more than 1 or 2 handouts in a class and talked about it, but now we can give 10.
Yeah. And maybe, as well as teachers needing to sort of tone it down a little bit, but perhaps we also need to be teaching our students how to navigate that type of learning experience. And, everything is scaffolded. So you'd say, I'm sending you 10 links, but actually they're split up into categories and you only need to pick 1 link from each category. Just to kind of give them that guidance on how to decide what to watch or what to listen to or what to read. It's definitely a lot. And my eldest is now starting, in the UK, we call it secondary school, but he'll be going to essentially middle school in the US. And I'm really psyching myself up for the complication that's about to come in our life.
When we think about the autistic students and accommodating them with best practices, one of the challenges that we experience is giving those best practices to teachers who are asked to do so much, and they may get a few days of training before each term, each semester, each year. But giving them best practices, a lot of teachers complain, well, what you told me to do 2 years ago, now you're telling me to do literacy this other way. Or now you're telling me to organize my classroom under this new theory. So how do we get best practices into the classroom without overwhelming the teacher and the administrators who are supposed to make this happen?
So I think, first of all, I guess I would take a step back and I would say, the powers that be, and then those who decide what best practice is really need to make sure they figured it out and we're consistent, blah, blah, blah. Once that's established, I would offer training in like a workshop style. So I'll, tell, this is what you do now, come back and, do it and invite me into your classroom and show me what you've done and we'll go through it together. But that's not quick and easy. I mean, people want quick and easy, but I think that's more effective is to work through situations, less lecturing and more doing. So, maybe instead of a school asking me to come in and talk to their entire staff about how they could best set up their classroom, really the ideal would be is I meet with each teacher for an hour And I don't lecture. We just start working on their classroom together. But so far, that model is time inefficient and expensive, so it doesn't really happen.
I hope listeners have enjoyed this episode of Perspectives on Neurodiversity. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and please leave a review if you found the discussion useful. Again, we were joined by Jenny Sandler. It is homeschooluk.com, and that will be in the show notes. Don't forget to read the Autistic Me blog and follow our post on social media. I am Christopher Scott Wyatt, speaking as the Autistic Me. Thank you, Jenny, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you, and it's been such an interesting conversation. Thank you.